Welcome to The Explainer. So let's jump right into something absolutely fascinating and honestly super relevant to all of us. What does it actually mean to be an American? I mean, as our society gets more and more diverse, this is kind of the ultimate modern mystery, right? Is there really just one unified American identity, or are we looking at something way more complex? Today, we're going to dig into the data, the sociology, and the really deep history of North America to figure this out. To anchor all of this, we're looking at a huge 2007 political science study by Deborah J. Schildkraut. She posed a brilliant question, honestly. She asked, is increasing ethnic diversity changing our normative identity? Basically, as the demographic makeup of the country shifts, are the unwritten rules and those shared beliefs of what makes an American shifting right along with it? Now, to find her answer, she uses this intellectual framework called the multiple traditions theory. And the idea here is pretty straightforward. Instead of hunting for one single unifying American creed, like a simple checklist of beliefs, this theory argues that American identity is actually defined by a broad, complex, and sometimes entirely contradictory set of norms. It's like a giant puzzle where the pieces don't always perfectly fit. Being American isn't just one thing. It's a tapestry of many different and sometimes clashing traditions, all existing at the exact same time. So here's our game plan. First, we'll look at the American identity question. Second, First Peoples and Civilizations. Third, the European arrival. And finally, we'll wrap up with our Multi-Creedal Society Today. Okay, let's kick things off with part one, the American identity question. It's incredibly easy to fall into the trap of thinking about American identity as a monolith, like this single, unchanging block of ideals. But when you actually zoom out and look at the sociological data, a completely different picture starts to emerge. Schildkraut's study rigorously tests a really specific claim that an increasingly multicultural America will naturally create a multi-creedal America. To figure this out, she looks at a huge range of norms. Think about how we balance the ideal of total individual freedom against our duty to the community, or classical liberalism versus civic republicanism. She's testing to see if a diverse population naturally builds an identity out of multiple differing creeds. We'll dive into her actual findings a bit later, but first we really need to understand where this multi-creedal foundation actually comes from. Which brings us to Section 2, First Peoples and Civilizations. To really wrap our heads around this multiple traditions concept, we have to rewind the clock. Because long before the United States was even a thought, this continent was already an absolute masterclass in diversity. I mean, by 10,000 BCE, Paleoindians were fully established across North America, branching out into hundreds of culturally distinct groups. Then, jump forward to around 600 BCE, and you've got the Adena culture building these massive earthworks in the east. Meanwhile, way out in the Pacific around 1200 CE, Tahitian explorers are settling Hawaii, launching a civilization that would basically remain isolated from the rest of the globe for centuries. We're talking about thousands of years of completely distinct, complex societies evolving on their own tracks. Just look at the sheer contrast between some of these early societies. It really builds the historical case for multiple traditions. On one hand, you had the Mississippian culture, centered around Cahokia, near what's now St. Louis. Back at its peak in the 12th century, this was a sprawling, centralized agricultural city. It had a population of 20,000 people. To put that in perspective, that was literally larger than London at the time. And it was anchored by this towering 100-foot structure called Monk's Mound. Now completely contrast that with the indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest. They were building incredibly affluent, permanent villages centered almost entirely around the salmon harvest. And they were governed by this complex, gift-giving culture known as the potlatch. These were two highly advanced but fundamentally different ways of life sharing the same continent. And it wasn't just cultural diversity. Political diversity was absolutely thriving too. Over in the Northeast, the mid-15th century saw the formation of the Iroquois Confederacy. This was a super sophisticated political union of 5 distinct tribes: the Oneida, Mohawk, Onondaga, Cahokia, and Seneca. They were represented by a council of 50 sachem chiefs. It is a stunning example of highly developed, complex governance and alliance building that existed way before any European models were ever introduced here. So the big takeaway here is this. From the mind-blowing multi-story cliff dwellings of the Anasazi in the Southwest, all the way to the Arawak-descended Taino people navigating the Caribbean and settling Puerto Rico, this land has always been a tapestry of incredibly varied traditions. The multiple traditions theory isn't just some modern sociological phenomenon. It is quite literally baked into the soil of the Americas. Let's move on to Section 3, the European arrival. Now, when European explorers and colonists started showing up, they didn't just wipe a uniform culture off the map and replace it with another uniform culture. Not at all. The continent's diverse foundations just got radically more complex, layered with brand new and, honestly, often conflicting norms. And European colonization wasn't a single monolithic event either. It was this staggered collision of different empires playing out over centuries. I mean, you have Norse explorers recording mentions of Vinland as early as 1075 CE. By 1493, the Spanish encountered the Taino in Puerto Rico. And it isn't until well over a century later, in 1607, that the British actually settled Jamestown. Each of these groups brought their own distinct languages, religions, and economic systems to totally different corners of the map. And as these empires dug in, the norms they brought were vastly different depending on where you were looking. The Spanish spread across Florida, New Mexico, and Texas, leaving a very specific cultural and architectural footprint. Meanwhile, the Dutch were busy building New Netherland right in the mid-Atlantic. And this Dutch colony was so formidable, it actually blocked British expansion down from New England all the way until 1664. So once again, you have multiple, deeply competing traditions taking root simultaneously. Of course, we have to objectively acknowledge the truly devastating reality of this era. This demographic collision between the newly arriving Europeans and the massively diverse native populations resulted in unprecedented tragedy. Because Native Americans had zero immunity to Eurasian diseases like smallpox and measles, they were hit by massive, sweeping epidemics. Entire populations were decimated, and ancient societies were severely disrupted. It permanently, fundamentally altered the demographic and cultural landscape of the entire continent. And even if we zoom in and just look at the 13 British colonies, a stark variety of economic and social norms developed. The culture up in New England, which was heavily driven by religious groups and maritime trade, was completely different from the southern colonies. The South built a totally different agricultural system, one that, as we know, relied fundamentally on the horrific practice of enslaving millions of people from Africa. So right from the very founding of the nation, deeply contradictory norms, these soaring ideals of liberty clashing head-on with the institution of slavery, were woven directly into the American fabric. All right, let's bring it into the present with Section 4, a Multi-Creedal Society Today. So, how does all this millennia-spanning history actually show up in the data today? Well, Schildkraut's empirical findings completely back up this multiple traditions perspective. Being American is, in fact, defined by a really broad range of norms. Just like our history shows us, a highly complex and frankly contradictory set of ideals exists right now today. For example, fiercely valuing egalitarianism and civil rights, while at the exact same time promoting rugged, self-reliant individualism. Because of this, it is virtually impossible to boil Americanism down into one neat little box. And perhaps the most fascinating part of her study? These complex views are shared widely across the entire population, completely regardless of a person's immigrant background. In fact, an overwhelming 80% of Americans share this complex, multi-creedal view of our national identity. That said, the study does objectively note about a 20% divergence. There are absolutely segments of the population that hold differing views on these norms. And, as the study rightfully points out, these are trends that political scientists really need to keep monitoring as our demographics continue to shift over time. But the overarching conclusion of Schildkraut's research is actually highly empowering. Quote, "Most Americans, regardless of their ethnic or immigrant background, share this complex view of the norms that constitute American identity. That incredible diversity that kicked off with the Paleoindians, that built Cahokia, that formed the Iroquois Confederacy, and survived the chaotic collision of global empires, it is still very much alive in how we view ourselves today. At our core, we truly are a multi-creedal society." Which leaves us with one final thought to chew on. We now know that American identity isn't just one static thing. It's a living, breathing collection of multiple traditions. So, as America continues to evolve, how will our complex, contradictory norms define the very next chapter of our identity? It's a pretty profound question, and honestly, one that every single generation gets to answer for themselves. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking questions and keep exploring.